All right. This reading combines kind of two focus that are interwoven. One is the documentary Waiting for Superman, and the other is Charter School. So I'm gonna try to go through this kind of quickly. I want you guys to have a better understanding of charter schools, maybe how they're different than vouchers. Um, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the author and the documentary. And Waiting for Superman came out. It was David Guggenheim, who's a well-known filmmaker, and there were a couple other documentaries that Diane Ravitch mentions that came out around the same time period that were very negative towards public education. Um, but Waiting for Superman was just in particularly like I think powerful. If you get a chance to watch it or see it, it focuses around the lives of like five students, and you really get caught up in their story. They're very compelling. All of these students want to get into a charter school, but it had a red carpet rollout. I mean, there were like A-list actors at the premiere. Um, Oprah devoted 2 weeks to it, like on her show. It was a tremendously influential documentary, and I really think it had an impact on charter schools, maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, and yeah, and again, it had this ominous tone. I always compare it to like the way to being like a hater in a sense. Like I think one of the things people who are haters do is they take things where there's a grain of truth and then they exaggerate it dramatically. And that to me, like there are grains of truth in Waiting for Superman and important topics to talk about. Like one that we're going to talk about soon is tracking. Um, so the issues are there, but it's very exaggerated. Diane Ravitch, I want to mention, she is a conservative. She was in the George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush's office. She was like the Undersecretary of Education. She was at Harvard for a while. She's written a number of books. I sometimes recommend her book here, The Life and Death of the Great American School System, when students have asked me for recommended like summer reading. Um, it's a good book. If you like the focus of the class, it would be a good book to read. Um, so when charter schools began, this is important to note. They were originally promoted as collaborators, and the idea actually was from the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers president at the time, Albert Shanker, and um, the idea I think was like an alternative space where teachers would have more control and influence, and and I always give the example like if you have a district where there's a lot of young women with children, who are um, um, teen parents or whatever, like it's very hard for them with a normal structure, but with a few changes, they can be very successful if you have some support childcare services and a different schedule, slightly more, that I think was sort of the idea Shanker had. They would work alongside with public schools. Of course, today they're promoted as competitors that will force, you know, public schools to get better or go out of business in a sense. Um, I'm not here to try to convince you that charter schools are good or bad. I think they're very complicated, and there's some that are very good and others not good. And what I would argue, from my perspective, that's bad, is the hype around them, the sort of distorted perception that people have that they're going to fix all the problems. Um, and then two, the other thing is this idea of competition, and I just think there are certain domains in which um, competition doesn't really work. I thought I mentioned that one of the issues with charter schools is that they're different in each state. Each state has a different policies, different laws, different regulations. In Indiana, it's kind of a combination, and we're not the worst in terms of charter schools, but we're let's just say we have a lot of problems, and I'll kind of get into this. You might be asking, what is a charter school? And I have to tell you, on some level, that is a good question. And because they are different in each state, it's a little hard. But basically, like let's say all of us got together in a room together, everybody from this course, and myself, we all got together in a room, and we just decided to create a charter. And we said, look, we're going to have a school that focuses on these values and has these kind of guiding principles, and then just put together a document of like, these are how we're going to run the school, and this is our focus. And then we would present that charter to an authorizer, and if it gets authorized, then we start receiving money, and we can open our doors, and we can invite in students. um, and so that's basically it. So they're fun. There are some for-profit charter schools, but they're funded by taxpayers. The money comes from the state. It's money that goes away from the public schools. So money that would normally go to public schools now goes to a charter, which is either a nonprofit or by a company or whoever. Um, and then yeah, and so get into more of the dynamics. I thought I'd mention Pitbull. If you're a Pitbull fan, he has a chain of charters in Florida. So if you want to send your kids to the Pitbull charter school, you can. Okay, and so I also want to point out that while charters have grown exponentially, the school population is still around 50 million. And so both vouchers and charters are not going to really solve all the woes of the education system. The vast majority of students are still in public schools. Um, this is kind of the number of charter schools. The darker green has more, and the lighter fewer. They've started to kind of like they've come under scrutiny in places like New York. I think Wyoming, which is fascinating because they have one of the best education systems in the nation, and other states like Minnesota and others strong, but they have very few. Probably a lot of that's for logistical reasons. States that are heavy into charters are like ever since Hurricane Katrina, um, New Orleans, that kind of area in Louisiana, and then Florida. So most in cities, which is another issue. Um, for profit have proliferated. Um, so waiting for Superman to kind of switch gears here and kind of get back in. I used to kind of show a clip from it before. I don't anymore. Again, it's pretty available if you get a chance to see it. One of the things on that I wanted you to know was the main message of Waiting for Superman. That is the idea that public education has failed. The problem's not money; it's bad teachers. That sums it up. Those three things: American education, public education's failed. Problems not money; it's bad teachers. And again, just to go back to that hater analogy, um, yeah, public education has not failed. We have a great public education system in many areas and in many places, as I mentioned. Um, that's not true. Uh, in terms of bad teachers, there are some bad teachers, but that oversimplifies the problem. And then we'll get into the money issue. Um, one of the and here's one of the big ones. He misrepresents NAEP data. Now, Diane Ravitch was on the board of NAEP for like 10 years, so she's an expert. She knows the NAEP data well. And what Waiting for Superman did was made it seem like 75% of schools are behind. 75% of students are like below grade level or below average, and that's not true. It's 25%. And yeah, that's something to be concerned about and to worry about. But it's there's a huge difference between 75%. Teachers, what Diane Ravitch says, which is true from all the research, is that look, teachers are the number one factor in schools. Um, they're more important than anything else. All the research shows that whether or not technology, environment, all these other things that you could put into the equation, the teacher is the most important factor, the most influential. But even teachers have correlate much less strongly with test scores than other issues, poverty being one of the main ones, which correlates really heavily. Teachers are very low, sort of connection between, and a lot of times, I mean, if you know, like standardized tests often too, what you're measuring to is the teacher from the previous year. It's very complicated. Um, So, um, now what I want to mention too, this is also important for you to know. Again, shifting gears a little bit back to charter schools now. In the movie Waiting for Superman, only well, I'll get into this, but he shows just a couple of the charter schools that are really well known, that are very popular. In reality, when the Credo study, by the way, was done by Stanford. It was professors in a number of different areas. It's the most comprehensive, detailed study of charter schools disaggregating for, um, you know, equal kind of public schools. And when you really look at charter school performance, about 17% are better of charter schools are better than traditional public schools. And then I would say most of these in here are marginally better, and there's a little bit of a sliver here that that are that do better than public schools, like significantly better. And I'm going to show you examples of those and why they do better. 37%, almost 40% are worse, and roughly 46% are similar or comparative. Um, and I'll just tell you that when we say worse too, there is a fraction in here that are way worse. And if you know the comedian John Oliver, he has a show on HBO where they do an in-depth look each week at a topic. He did charter schools, and I didn't post it because there's a lot of profanity in it. But if you get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend, because he really shows some of the problems, and there's just some crazy examples that have happened around the country, of charter schools like unperforming. But this is similar to Indiana, by the way. Like a few charter schools in Indiana have an A ranking, but a much larger percentage, about almost twofold, about almost double, have D or F range, and then there's some that are in the C range. Um, there's a lot of corruption around charter schools around the country, a lot of corruption, and then when you have embezzlement, and again, the John Oliver segment really gets into that. But in addition to the corruption, as a side note, there's also a lot of shady practices. And one of the things that happens a lot, for example, like let's say I am a real estate investor or something, and I own a bunch of land or buildings, old buildings, in Southside Muncie that are pretty much abandoned and nobody wants to use them, right? I can't rent them out. Well, what I decide to do is open a charter school under another nonprofit. So I create a nonprofit, I get a charter, I open a charter school. Well, then I put that in my building and I rent it to the charter school. Now, technically, it's not illegal at this point, but you should probably see that that's like it's a ethical sort of issue. And then, two, there's a lot of places that then create companies that oversee the own charter schools that they own. So they're overseeing, if that kind of makes sense. There's just a lot of like shady stuff that happens. Um, there's a great segment on Vice that's called "No Choice But to Choose," and if you ever get a chance to watch it, it's phenomenal. It looks at Michigan, which where Betsy DeVos comes from, has an incredibly aggressive charter program. Um, they're the one state in the nation where education's actually declined. It's gotten worse uh, over the last few years. And a lot of people associate that with the growth in charters and the diminishment of public schools. Um, all right, so this relates to another point. Jeff Canada runs the Harlem Children's Zone, which is a great school and program. They provide wraparound services, but he has assets of over $200 million. He was a Harvard grad, and he's been able to raise a lot of money. He gets paid $400,000 annually. He also does a lot of speaking engagements. He spoke at Ball State a few years ago. Now, two things to mention here that are important. One is that, look, even when he struggled with a group of, he has kids in poverty, and even though he has all these wraparound services and social workers and different things, a group of his middle school students were not going to pass an exam, and he ended up kicking out the entire class. He just got rid of them. So even though you have all that money, it's not a guarantee that you're gonna, you know what I mean, not have any problems. And then two, the other thing is that the movie Waiting for Superman is disingenuous in the sense that it can't claim that money's not a factor when all the examples of charter schools that they hold up in the movie have like outrageous amounts of money, um, and services and um, so whatever. Kicking out that whole group, it was a book and then turned into a documentary. If you're interested in that, again, the movie is just disingenuous. It doesn't show good public schools. It doesn't show failing charter schools. It doesn't talk about other issues. It uses Finland as a positive example, but doesn't really examine Finland in depth. Um, so, and then Ravage points out, look, like, are we willing to take these examples of good charter schools and then replicate them? And if we do that, we got to get serious about funding, because Green Dot, again, is another example. They just pumped in like $15 million and saw a modest test score gain. But DC Seed is another great school. This is like a boarding school in DC for students in poverty. But they spend $35,000 per student annually. So, and again, to put that in comparison, Indiana spends around, um, $6,000 to $7,000 annually. So, I'll just mention too. Another quick thing is that I am on a review board for the. If you don't know, Ball State is a charter authorizer. Our last president, President Gora, was really ambitious in terms of promoting charter schools. And then the legislature this year, because of all the abuse and problems, wanted review boards for charter schools, and so I volunteered to be on the one for Ball State. And what's been really interesting to me is that a lot of like wealthy districts um, lobby against them. They don't want them, and they come out and they get rid of them. And this year, Muncie, a charter school from Michigan was planning to open up in Muncie, and the people from the north side of the people with money in Muncie basically stood up and pushed back, and they decided to drop it, the company. And this, I'll tell you another thing with this. The one that was proposed for Muncie would be part-time face-to-face, but then mostly too like virtual. And I can just tell you that virtual charter schools are, I don't even know what's going on. It's just crazy. Like, they have students. I mean, there's a bunch with graduation rates like around like 3 to 6%. I mean, of students who are graduating. Like most of the students just aren't doing anything. Um, and you got to think about putting a kid in front of a computer and expecting them to get an education. I mean, it might work for a rare number of students, but like there are Daleville, Indiana, which is a town with, I don't think, more than a few hundred people, has 4,000 students enrolled in an online virtual charter school. Um, so there are other issues like virtual charter schools, um, and again, I think like wealthy districts are standing up and pushing back because they like their public schools. They don't want to see them damaged. And that too is another point that I wanted to mention. Um, 2 points really quickly from the reading that I forgot to mention. One is that Ravage points out that even though the public perception of schools sometimes is negative, today in the United States, over, I think it's around 80% of teachers or of parents, parents rate their own public school and their child's teacher with an A rating, and that's at an all-time high. So most people like their neighborhood schools, like their teachers, and I think that's our perspective too. That's how my wife and I feel about Muncie schools, very positively. Um, and like a lot of the positive things don't get, aren't out in the public often or talked about enough. The other thing is that the other problem with saying teachers is that 50% of teachers leave in the first 5 years. And that's another important fact to know, and a major problem in education. A lot of really good people end up leaving the field early. And that level of turnover, I don't think you see in other professions, and that's a real problem. That's obviously because of other issues that are structural, kind of in the system. Um, so if you get a chance to watch some of the videos on charter schools, I think that'd be really good. And another thing I'll mention too, like about the charter schools that were being slated for Muncie, is that when they first started too, around the hype, they all have these ideas or like names like academies, and then they like the the one proposal I read for the one in Muncie, it was like, we don't have hallways, we have ladders to, we have paths to success. We don't have students, we have scholars. We don't have There's all this lofty rhetoric that, I mean, when my wife and I were talking, like when we read through parts of it was just like eye roll after eye roll. And I think that like for example, charter schools were really sold to the African American community, and the NAACP actually has called for a moratorium on charter schools. They don't want charter schools anymore. They want high quality public schools, um, because there have been so many problems and things. So I really like how Diane Ravitch ends the piece. You know, when she recalls, those things you see on TV where they do the lottery and the parents are crying and trying to get their kids into these really, amazing schools like Harlem Children's Zone, or um and cynically, thinking about using the parents as pawns to promote them. But she said, I also felt an immense sense of gratitude the much maligned public education system, where no one has to win a lottery to gain admission. And I just really appreciated that final kind of piece. So I'll wrap up, and again, I hope some of it was helpful.